aren't we creating a true de-streaming model for education that will eliminate the placing of racialized special education and lower income students into streams that will limit their pathways?
Locally developed was really designed, or essentials programming is really designed to support students that are really, really, really behind. Locally developed is also there for students who want to get their OSSD, but have severe cognitive impairment or intellectual disabilities. And some students with those designations, may not be, inclusion might not actually be the best thing for them. So, the idea is when we tackle streaming, it's not in grade 9, right? I think everybody has made it really clear that streaming happens far before that. And if we can make inclusion work in elementary school, eventually, this is my take on it, is that locally developed will become even more obsolete. And I'm not sure that students will really want to go into locally developed if they were, if they were going to be streamed to applied, because there is just such a stigma, to go into locally developed. I think people had thought that, if you go into applied, then you can probably switch into academic. We know that's usually not the case. That doesn't happen as frequently as we think it does. But I think locally developed is a pathway that a lot of people really shy away from unless it's absolutely necessary. And some schools are using it creatively to bridge students to go from, if they're really struggling in elementary, they'll take a bridging program, and some schools code that with locally developed, but then they're automatically placed into academic in the second semester. So, right now there's still a niche need for it. But I think that if we do this inclusion thing right, that I don't see that actually being something that is used as much in secondary schools. At least that's my hope.
It does in part depend how the ministry restructures. All they've said is this foundational course, right? And if that means an open level course, then the barrier that locally developed will be is less than if it is somehow differentiated, right? And so I think we are hoping for additional clarity from the ministry about what they mean by that. But that is, I guess, an important distinction versus the approach that the TDSB has taken, which is moving everyone to academic.
Many students are transferred throughout their elementary education because of board and government policies and enter grade 9 at a much lower level than they need to be at to be successful in grade 9. Why aren't we doing something about this first before dumping every student into academic, even though they may not be prepared, and ensuring their failure or their transfer to essentials, which is a pathway that doesn't lead to post-secondaries?
The inclusion model is something that we're doing earlier, specifically because it's exposing students who were in previously in HSP programs and who were not seeing grade level work. Now they're being exposed to grade level work. And I mentioned briefly when I was speaking earlier that so many times when those students from the HSP class were integrated into another grade level class, their proper grade level class, they were successful and they were able to make connections to the grade level learning. So I think a first step for sure is the fact that we now have inclusion. I think the next and biggest, hurdle is our own personal educator pedagogical shifts and what that looks like in our classroom. What's happening with the inclusion model is the teacher who used to have been designated as the HSP teacher, they may be allocated to 3 or 4 different classrooms, and they'll go into those classrooms so you have an opportunity to have 2 educators in the room at a time. And so what's happening in some spaces is they're like, fine, you want us to do inclusion? The HSP students will sit at the back table with the HSP teacher and they'll do their work that they're comfortable with, and we'll continue on doing what we want to do. And that's happening in a lot of spaces. So the first step is the inclusion model, but the second step is how are we as educators shifting our pedagogical stance and creating low floor, high ceiling for access for every student in that classroom so that they feel like they belong. Everybody was in the same class in grade 8. They can be in the same class in grade 9 as well, with the differentiation that Jody spoke about earlier, and with us being willing to shift.
The inclusion model, I wasn't asked to do it. I was supported, but I was the one who was pursuing it. So it was still on the teacher level as opposed to administration saying, we need to do this. I've had so many situations where the student wasn't actually behind. The deficit wasn't on the part of the student, but it was a part on the pedagogy. And so I think every time someone asks themselves, does the student need an IEP? We need to flip that question to say, what am I not offering in my programming? Because chances are that student does have the ability, you just didn't give them access to the information or the right way to demonstrate their knowledge. And teachers have to be willing to get past, I think, Christine, you called it ego, I would call it guilt, all these other things about recognizing that we can do better.
My personal experience, when I went to high school, we had to do a grade 9 French test. Everybody from my elementary school failed. And we're in a grade 9 class made of a mixture of students from different elementary schools in the area, but anybody from my school failed. So instead of looking at it as maybe there's a larger issue here, they chose to look at it as we, the students, were the problem. Right? So the blame then is put on the student rather than looking back at the grade 8 French teacher or whatever subject teacher that brought these kids who was responsible for teaching these children certain things and making them prepared for grade 9, right? The lack of preparedness for grade 9, right? And I feel like that is on the part of the school board to take their part in understanding that sometimes they fall below par, right? And that there are some times where there are teachers there that are not doing what they're supposed to be doing or making sure the children are prepared for school for the next level. And instead of blaming children, instead of blaming their income, instead of blaming their race, instead of blaming all these other things, look at the school, look at the teachers, retrain, do these things, make sure the teachers that you have are up to par, are doing what they need to be doing in order to make these children successful, right? Teaching is a hard job. Not everyone can do it. I can't be a teacher. I can't do it. You go to school to do it, right? You go to school to do it. You're trained to do it. So to me, your job is to reach children in the way that they can be reached. It's hard, but that is your job, right? And so I find that instead of blaming students, we need to look more so on teachers and the school boards and the supports that teachers may not have in their individual schools, and why these kids are not as successful when they move on to secondary.
How do we get teachers to feel this moral imperative to believe that all students are capable of learning and that an IEP doesn't automatically mean that students aren't capable of being successful? How do we make those shifts and support teachers in shifting their mindset and their pedagogy and instead of using a deficit mindset on kids?
There has to be more safeguards. Like, it can't be, in my opinion, like one teacher that says, I had this student in my class and I feel like they have a learning deficit or they need an IEP. It follows them throughout their school years, right? And the next teacher doesn't question it. The next teacher doesn't question it. And before you know, your life chances are cut in half because someone didn't do the work to figure out for themselves, does this person actually have this IEP? That happened to my son in elementary school. I got a message on Instagram from a friend who noticed that she had taught my son, and she was in the staff room and she overheard this teacher talking about me as a parent and him as a child, not knowing that I'm standing there, I'm ready and willing to fight for my child. But she thought, okay, I'm younger looking, so she came up with XYZ reasons as to why she came up with some sort of mirage of who I am, right? And you're sitting there discussing me and my child in a staff room with teachers that potentially will teach my son next. So what happens then? The next teacher already has an idea of my son, right? And so I feel like in cases where teachers want to put in IEPs or label children, there needs to be a system. It cannot be the same teachers in the same school. It has to be, okay, you think this, go to the next person in another school or another board or another division that you have to explain why you feel this way and prove it. Prove why you feel this.
I've experienced this a lot where when you read an IEP, I read an IEP from a student written from the previous teacher. There's a huge long list in the needs section, and there are 1 or 2 points in the strengths section, right? And so even just thinking about what we're doing when we're filling in those IEPs and thinking about these children, I mean, as our own children, and what would we want for our own children? And what are the strengths? Because honestly, just because they have a couple of learning needs doesn't mean that that strengths column shouldn't be just as full. But we get so focused on, oh, this kid is so hard to teach, this kid needs this kid needs that, and so on. And we forget to think about them as the whole child.
Knowing your students and shifting the school climate. And by that, I mean, I think there may be teachers who have a perception of how students are feeling, but it's not accurate. And so I know we have climate surveys, but on a school level, for example, at my last school, we created a school climate survey that we could analyze, and the teachers came up with a plan based on that school climate survey. But then we had students involved, and they said, no, your plan isn't very good. This is what you need to be doing. So I think that student voice and respecting what they're contributing, because they know how they're feeling in that building. And we perhaps at times the teachers are making assumptions as to how the students are feeling in the class, in the building, but having them more active and engaged as the stakeholders, which they are.
What will happen in grade 11 and 12? Will the distinctions between college and university level courses still be considered? And has there been any data on this from the grade 11, 12 levels?
There are reports out from, organizations like the OECD, like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, I think. So they've suggested, as did, other groups that study this kind of thing, is that making choices should happen like in the later high school years. So at around grade 11 would be a time that is sufficient to make those kinds of decisions. Now, is the college versus university pathway as we see it right now, is that something that might need to change? Well, there's ideas that, because colleges, just like universities, are degree granting now, like they're essentially, similar types of post-secondary institutions, right? Like some might focus a little bit more on the hands-on aspects of things, but I mean, they both can lead to degree accomplishments, right? So maybe it's more about focusing courses on the type of program. So like, is it a STEM program? Is it a business program? Is it an arts program? That might be pie in the sky, but right now, as we see it, and especially in the TDSB, we're hoping that grade 9 and 10, as we see it right now, is academic only. And then in grade 11 and 12, they can start to make those decisions about whether they want to take college preparation courses or not. But if we keep these options open, I think that the vast majority of students are going to continue on to university programming, but then maybe go to college as a result, right? We know that students that take university preparation courses are better prepared for college than students that take college preparation courses. So if we can make that message clear for our students when they're making those choices, I think that again, that those choices might not necessarily need to be choices. Like they might just continue on to university programming.
I think it's not to say that there will be no streaming or no, differentiation at all through all of secondary, but maybe we need to take a hard look at the choices we make. Does this need to be a C or a U, or can this be an M? Like, where can we remove barriers? But I think, at least starting with grade 9 makes people changing their minds easier later on. And so we think it makes sense to start with grade 9 and 10, but yeah, the idea is all options open for students for through their whole secondary experience should be the goal for sure.
When students are identified as MID, DD, LD, MID, all of these designations, does this not have a similar effect as streaming?
I think when it comes to autism, DD, MID, LD, they can be a way to stream students into alternate programs. But they can also be an opportunity to put students in groupings that work better for them. And somebody just down the list said something about the voice of parents. And so this is, I think, really important, where parents have a choice about where they think their child will do best. And so we have to make sure that once these students have these specific designations, that the parents are very specifically involved in all of those decisions, which they are. They're in the IPRC meetings. They're deciding whether they want to accept placements and all of those sorts of things. But we have to make sure that they aren't sort of railroaded and saying, listen, you're so-and-so, your child is not going to make it in the regular classroom, so we really recommend that you send them to that program. We have to honor the decisions that parents make. And so if you have a student in your classroom who was offered a DD placement, but the parents chose not to take it, you then, as the educator, have a choice about how you then are going to make sure that that child is included in your class. So I think it's sort of a spectrum of answer of, yes, it can be streaming. Can it be for positive? Yes, but it can sometimes also be a way of trying to force people into pigeonholing where they think their child should belong. So for some students, and because I've worked in a lot of schools where these programs are running and are successful, and children are very happy and families are very happy. But I've also worked in schools where it does feel like a sort of a dumping ground of the teachers bored and tired, and the students are kind of sitting around doing anything, and there aren't any high expectations being held for students in those classes. And so I think that's one of the really big worries, as well as what's happening in those classes if they are going to be in those specialized classrooms.
In my experiences in secondary, when, in my school, we have an LD, MID grouping, which like they're very different things, first of all, so I don't know why they're grouped that way, right? But then also like I was teaching academic math to students in our MID program, because I noticed that our students, again, are just always pigeonholed into a lesser than program simply because of their diagnosis. And when I was in that class, and we did some different things, made things more accessible, but the expectations are high. We also brought in students from the mainstream program in to try to make it a more heterogeneous group. And again, those students were just blowing me away. Like, it was wild to think that again, students with an MID designation have always been written off, and to see them again thriving when there's an expectation that they're going to be doing well and the supports that are there, it does wonders. And things like MID, for instance, like MID is not a real thing, like it's not a medically acknowledged identification, and then when you take that into take your IEP with your MID designation, you go to a college or university, they don't know what to do with it because it's not actually a real thing. It's another category that our school system uses to label students and put them in programming that is away from non special education students. So it's like labels like that can be very, very problematic. Yes, there are some very good programs that are, very, very successful LD programs and autism programs, but these things need to be like really critically looked at to make sure that that's really what's there for a student. Like, I had a student that was put into a congregated special education program for grade 9 and 10, didn't earn a credit. Nobody asked him that he actually wanted to go to college. So then he came to our school and again was just doing amazing in our academic program. It's just amazing. Like Derek put in a point there about in the chat about misdiagnoses. Like we just see these things as facts, but really, disability is a social construct, right? Just like race. And we need to really interrogate what that means for that particular student.
If you could send a message to this government right now about how to get de-streaming right, what would that be? And specifically taking into account, how do we ensure that we don't follow the path that has happened in the past where de-streaming follows this path of superficial inclusion, but really what it is an austerity measure with larger class sizes, less supports, an effort to save money. So knowing that that's what's happened in the past, what message would you send to this government about what needs to happen in order to do this right?
I think it's a totally legitimate worry that this government is going to try to plow ahead without sufficient thought, resources, collaboration, and repeat a lot of the same mistakes that have been made in the past. We have to do everything we can to try to fight to ensure that that doesn't happen. But I think in a lot of the comments made and in the chat as well about culture, that a lot of this comes down to just human beings, and it will take time to shift that culture, and that all takes thoughtful engagement and training and resources, and then there's just some structural pieces too about how we roll this out, but the first part is the most important. And so I think would just echo some of the comments that I made off the top, which is I think a multi-stakeholder kind of table that includes people with, lived experience through streaming, educators who've gone through this, and also the proper education system folks who can plan a thoughtful implementation approach over the coming year or two would be our kind of number one recommendation. And through that, I think they can work out, the types of supports and resources and training that others have spoken about tonight. But I think that that's probably the most important thing to get right. And I think it was Jason's point, how that has not happened with this back to school chaos is worrisome. And so we have to continue to push for that.
I think the government has to work on, like I said previously, hiring teachers to fit the demographic of the students they're teaching in these certain neighborhoods, in every neighborhood, right? I think once you have teachers that look like the students, their lived experiences, things they've gone through, enables them, or should enable them, to be able to reach the students that look like them, because they have a different perspective, right? I feel like in doing so, then you also help the children, the students, be able to be engaged in school, because these teachers will then also be able to figure out a way to reach these children in a way that they will be interested. Also changing the curriculum, like the things they're learning, right? We're learning in terms of the curriculum itself right now, it's based off of I would say very Eurocentric histories and methods and things, and it doesn't speak to everybody, right? And then you're using this to judge children who are not interested in these things, who these techniques don't reach, and then holding them to a standard with everybody else, and then claiming that they don't understand, and then using that to label and stream them, right? So finding teachers that look like the students, changing the curriculum to reflect change time, finding ways to reach students, so that way they can also bring up their level of engagement and wanting to learn and wanting to further their education, right? It's difficult to teach somebody who doesn't want to learn, right? And then that also enables teachers and the school boards to label these children.
I think it takes the government to listen to those that are affected by this and who have the most at stake. And again, I'll point to the idea that, this return to school is, the first priority, the second priority, and the third priority of this government. And yet, here we are 2 weeks before teachers have to go back, and we still don't have clarity on this. I think the government needs to have, they need to take ownership of where they've stumbled, and, commit and move forward in a way that's restorative to the relationships between them and the teachers and the communities You know, that's wishful thinking perhaps, but that's what needs to happen.
What are the additional actions that we as educators and not just educators, but anyone involved in invested in the education system, the public education system, what are the actions that we can take to ensure systemic changes at the provincial level, but also just in our schools? And what kinds of political actions do educators need to take?
On the government and board's part, it's investment. They have to believe in the importance of this change and shift, but also then create that investment. We need supports. We need human resource supports. We need educational supports and technologies and educational resources, and trying to approach it in a way that it's not moving a demographic into a previously determined space, but actually having a chance to reinvent something and creating a new space. And it doesn't always have to come from the top down. That teachers can choose to try to create that shift if it's not happening yet in their schools, and finding the support systems around them. Even as simple as finding some of these people, great leaders on Twitter, and following the Shelley Moores, and finding out who is doing the advocating, and finding other teachers who you can go to observe. But it's a large collective shift that needs to happen.
The journey of how the TDSB, you know, went from like a small group of educators to what we call academic pathways, or essentially Destreaming, making its way into a system multi-year plan, is really, you know, strategic in that if you like, we know that streaming is an oppressive and harmful structure that is inequitable and unjust, and if you don't tackle it, you are violating board policies, you're violating human rights policies, you are violating like everything that you know, that school boards need to uphold. And so I think, you know, if you're working at a school board that currently doesn't have this on the radar, is that you need to, you know, there are people in positions of power and authority in your school boards that do believe in this work, and sometimes they just need you know, a small group of dedicated people that are willing to kind of go at it on their own first. You know, make sure that you have that policy piece under your belt, and know that you're standing on solid ground when you're doing this kind of work, and hoping that permeates through. And that's kind of just what happened with the TDSB. It took you know, 4 or 5 years for that to happen, but when you have the right side of the policies on, like, with you, there's really like a clear path forward, and all it takes is the right people in the right places to advocate for you in those higher positions. So principals, superintendents, there will be people on board, and especially now that the ministry has identified that this is the path moving forward, people are going to line up and want to be like on the right side of this.
To join our coalition as a very important step. And then, but also I think would say, you know, somebody said it in the chat, there's a lot of voices out there against Destreaming, right? Like, we are in a bubble right now of a lot of support, but a lot of teachers, lots of parents who think that this will, you know, lower expectations, get, you know, troublesome youths with their students, right? Like, the voices are real and loud and have access. And so the TDSB managed to sort of push through that against significant opposition due to its, you know, leadership. I am much less convinced that those conditions will be in place in Sudbury and, you know, Waterloo and across this province. And so I think we need to also have the voices of people on this call and broader continue to use their voices in local communities to say, yes, we support this, and that, yes, this is why, because I don't think we should take for granted that this is a universally held position.
It's also really important to invite parents in. because a lot of parents, while, you know, Sam is saying, you know, we have parents who are saying, well, what's that going to do for my child's education prospects? And if the curriculum is going to be dumbed down for them, you know, we hear all of that nasty language, but there are just a lot of parents who just don't know, right? And they don't, they think, well, if my kid has been traditionally on an IEP, well, I guess applied is good for them and the teacher knows best. And so wanting to, I think it's just really important that we're educating parents, and, you know, I'm doing it parent by parent at a time. Parents of like friends of mine who are parents of students who I've been working with. But, you know, so yes, the one-to-one, but also how can we invite parents in and call parents in and give them more information and let them understand, especially our racialized or marginalized families who may also have language barriers. And so they put all the trust into the school to make all the decisions for their children. So, you know, I just, a way of making sure that everybody who has a stake in this has the information in an accessible way that they can then advocate for their children as well.